Boy, sometimes Providence. You know, if you were looking for it, you could probably find God's providence at work in most any story you read from the Bible. You know, if you're really looking for it. Of course, the Holy Spirit has seen fit to give us some stories that really are directed more at showing God's providence. Some of my favorites are the story of Joseph, Lydia, Esther, stories like that. Great stories for showing God's providence. Of course, for this morning's lesson, I've chosen the story of Esther. And the reason that I've chosen the story of Esther is because her story is different from other stories. In that, in the book of Esther, God is not mentioned anywhere in there. So if we're going to find God in that story at all, it's going to have to be through His hand of providence in the lives of the people in that story, okay? So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to go through all the things that happened leading up to a day when there was this terrible event that was supposed to take place. If you've read the book of Esther, then you know I'm talking about the annihilation of the Jews. And I want to link together the chain of events that in the end prevented it from happening, okay? And in doing this, we're going to see if we can find God in this story, okay? Now, I want to talk about some of the people in this story as we go along. First of all, the king in this story was a man by the name of King Ahasuerus. Okay, that's what the Hebrews called him. The Greeks called him Xerxes, I think, X-E-R-X-E-S. It's hard to pronounce it. It really doesn't matter. One pronunciation is as good as the other. They didn't have any vowels. All they had was consonants, so it would have been impossible to have a good pronunciation of it anyway. But King Ahasuerus, he ruled over 127 provinces, which included all of what was known of at that time as Asia. And every Jew who was alive and on the earth at that time lived within King Ahasuerus' dominion, okay? Well, King Ahasuerus, now he was also known for sending the largest army into Europe that ever had marched into battle. And the reason I bring that up is because to kind of give you a timeline of when things happened, because it was after he returned from that expedition that these things happened in the life of Esther. Now there's another man that's involved in this story, a man by the name of Haman. And this guy, I guess the king kind of treated him like a best friend, you know, like a best buddy. He elevated him above all the princes of his kingdom, made him prime minister. And he even issued a decree that said that every subject of his realm was to show respect to this man whenever he came into people's presence. And well, you know what? This is really where all the trouble started for the Jews in this story, because you see, Mordecai, he was a very well respected, a wise man, a Jewish man, and he man of wealth and power in his own right. Esther chapter 2 and verse 21 says that he sat within the king's gate. So he was one of the king's servants, okay? And so for reasons, though, that the Bible does not give, Mordecai refused to show any kind of respect to Haman whatsoever. You know, if you know any of the history about the old Persian kings, then you know he had to be pretty brave to disobey any kind of a decree that was sent out by the king, and because he was evidently willing to risk no matter, you know, any kind of punishment that he might get for doing that. But, you know, you see, in the first place, Mordecai was a faithful Jew. And the Jewish religion would never allow him to show any kind of respect to anybody who was involved in idolatry. Most likely Haman was too, because, you know, most of the Persian religions back then were all eat up in idolatry. But as soon as Mordecai's disobedience was found out by Haman, it was brought to his attention by some of the servants inside the gate that noticed it. And they also told him that Mordecai was a Jew. Well, you know, he saw what he thought was an opportunity to put the hurt on Mordecai. See, it's chapter 3, verse 5 says that he was filled with wrath. He wanted revenge on Mordecai. Okay, and so he decided. This man was so full of pride and arrogance that he decided he was going to take out the entire people of Mordecai, not just punish him as an individual. But now, if you think about what's going on here and you put everything into perspective, this is just Satan's handiwork. You see, because this is just another attempt by Satan to cut off the lineage of Jesus, to keep him from going to the cross. Yeah. All right? And so this is what's going on. You see, if Satan had been successful through his worker Haman there in annihilating the Jews, then you know what? All of those promises that God had made to people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you know, they wouldn't have meant anything. Would have been brought to nothing. Well, anyway, well, I had something else I wanted to tell you about, and now I turned 60 the other day, so y'all bear with me. Anyway, let's turn to chapter 3, verses 8 through 11. And so as Haman moves forward with his plan to annihilate the Jews, he had to figure out what day he wanted to carry out this annihilation, and so they cast Pur, or lot, to find out what the day was, and it fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, okay? So now all he needs to do, he knows what day he wants to do it, so he needs to go in and talk the king into doing what he wants to do. So in verses 8 through 11, he goes in and he says to the king, he says, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. You know, when you think about the way these old kings did stuff, those old Persian kings, they did, you know, it seems like they didn't take into consideration human life at all whenever they did something. They were just going to, you know, they were going to do whatever they felt was in the best interest of their kingdom, and that was all there was to it, okay? So now that Haman has the power to do what he wants to do, and he wants to move forward with his plan, well, the scribes are called in, the letters are written out in all the different languages of the 127 provinces. The letters were sent to every governor in every place, and the letters were to be issued as law in every province that the people would rise up on that 13th day of the 12th month and kill every Jew, man, woman, and child. Not one was to be spared. Well, as soon as Mordecai found out about this decree that was sent out by Haman, oh man, he was just tore up about it. I mean, he ripped his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. I do that every time. Ashes, and you know, he was torn up about it, because you see, he knew who was behind it. He knew very well it was Haman that was behind it, and he knew that Haman would carry it out. He knew that because, you see, it was common knowledge that there was this little article in the Constitution of the Medes and the Persians that once something had been sent out, sealed with the king's signet ring, that there was no way it could be reversed or undone, you see. And so he knew that Haman would carry it out. But, you know, I think about the Jews, though, in this situation. Put yourself in their shoes. Can you imagine what it would be like to wake up one morning and find out that not too long from now an entire nation of people is going to rise up against you and try to wipe out your entire race? Because that's exactly what the Jews were faced with here. Okay? It was just a very serious situation. Well, Mordecai, you know, he sends word to Queen Esther about it in chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, because, you know, he wants her to go in and plead with the king for the life of her people. Now, of course, if you read this story, you know King Ahasuerus, man, he was head over heels for Esther. He loved her. I mean, he dearly loved this woman. You know, Queen Esther, now, she was a Jewess. She had been this little orphan girl one time, so her parents had passed away. And, of course, being family, Mordecai, being her cousin, he took her in, and he raised her as his own. So he was the father figure in her life. And, you know, what would Esther do if she goes in to plead with the king? She's the power, you know. She's queen over all the land now. She's really come a long way from where she was. But what's she going to do when she goes in to see the king? What's she going to say that's going to do one bit of good? Mordecai sure didn't know what to tell her to say. Okay. Well, in chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, it says, Then Esther spoke to Hathach. Now, Hathach, he's kind of like the gopher in all this. He gets to run back and forth delivering messages. And so she spoke to Hathach, gave him a command for Mordecai. So she sends a message to Mordecai, and she says, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law. Put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Well, you see, Esther's trying to tell Mordecai, look here, man, do you realize what it is that you're asking me to do? Because what it boiled down to, he was asking her to put her life on the line. You know, if you walked in there uninvited, more likely than not, you're going to be executed on the spot. Okay? And so this is what it all boiled down to, and she wanted to know if he realized what he was asking her to do. You know, I mean, you would be executed, that is, unless the king decided to hold out the golden scepter to you. So in verses 13 and 14, Mordecai sends word back to Esther, and he says, do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. You know, we often talk about, and we do it in sermons and classes all the time, how that God can take a bad situation and he can turn it into something good for his purposes, right? Yeah. Well, when we talk about that, what are we talking about? We're talking about providence, aren't we? We're talking about being involved in something in order to have a certain outcome in the end, okay? And so that's exactly what we're talking about, and it's what Mordecai is talking about. It's what Mordecai is trying to get Esther to understand in this message to her, okay? And so, you know, he's letting her know that, look, just because you're living up there in the palace with the king, you think you're all safe and all that, don't think so, because you're not safe. As a matter of fact, if you don't speak up and do something about it right now, you and your father's house, in other words, me and you, Mordecai and her, are going to perish. He's the father. He's talking about himself. Well, Mordecai, you know, obviously believes that this thing will be prevented, you know. I mean, what did he say? He said relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. He believed it. He believed that God's providence would kick in eventually somewhere. And of course, him and Esther, they weren't going to make it. But, you know, it seems that as Mordecai is trying to find some way to save his people, you know, all his hope seems to rest in Esther, this young girl. But, you know, in verse 16, Esther, she sends word back to Mordecai. You can, you know, and it's easy to see in her answer that this noble young girl has really grown up to be a great woman of valor and a woman of faith. But in verse 16, she says back to Mordecai, she says, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Man, she was brave. She's braver than me. But, you know, so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. You know, this girl, I mean, she is a great woman of valor in this story. But, you know, think about what she's doing here. She's going to go without food or water for 3 days. I don't think any of us would be looking too good, you know, after that. I mean, you imagine Brother Gary after going 2 or 3 hours, you know. But, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, you know, I mean, just imagine she's going to go in there and try to look good in front of the king, but after 3 days of going through that, you know, she's bound to not look too good, even though she's going to be putting on her royal robes and all that. Is she going to look good enough that the king is going to ignore her disobedience and hold out the golden scepter and allow her to live? You know, that was the big question in all of this. Well, in verses 2 and 3, it says, so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. I was thinking about that, and I thought, this is such a serious situation. I imagine her hand was shaking as she reached out to touch that scepter. You know, I mean, her life was on the line here. Well, it says, and the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. Now, I want you to notice the next thing. Notice her reply here in verse 4, because it's kind of unexpected what she does. She says, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I prepared for him. Well, do you think she went in there and risked her life to ask him to dinner? I don't think the king thought that for 1 minute. But he goes ahead, he agrees to it, and they go to the banquet. He sent for Haman. They went to the banquet and they ate and they drank and everything. And finally, the king decides to ask her once again in verses 6 through 8. What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done. Well, here we go again. Verses 7 and 8. Look at her reply there. She says, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. I guess it wasn't such a good time after all. You know, the king thought it was a good time to ask her, but you know, and I mean, I'm sure that he's kind of getting curious about what's going on with this woman. What, you know, what's up here? Why, you know? But anyway, he and Esther, she kind of seems to be familiar that the way to a man's heart's through his stomach, right? She must have met Gary. I don't know. Anyway, and the king he pretty much confirms that in his willingness to come back the next day and do it all over again. But then again, as I said a while ago, you know, the king he's in love with this woman, you know, so why in the world wouldn't he want to come back the next day and spend some more time with the woman that he dearly loves, okay? Well, anyway, as soon as that banquet's all over with and everything, old Haman, he's all happy because he got to go in there and act like a bigwig and hang out with the king and the queen. And but he can't just wait. He just can't wait to get home and brag to everybody about it. So, but then, you know, when he's leaving the palace, as he gets out there where the gate is, he sees something that just destroys his good mood all to pieces. In verses 9 through 13, it says, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he went and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I'm again invited by her along with the king. Yet all of this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. You know, we see people like this all the time. I mean, this guy, he is in such a good position in his physical life. I mean, you know, with a word, he can have anything he wants. He can do anything he wants. He's got wealth. He's got power. He's got everything. He's got it made. Yet with all of that, he's going to let this little thing with Mordecai drive him out of his mind. But you see, that's just the way a lot of people in this world are. You know, I mean, you let one little glimmer of resistance come into their perfect little world, and they're going to lose their mind over that. You know. But anyway, in verse 4 it says, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. Now that's like 75 feet high. You know, this is some serious hanging going on here. But it says, and in the morning suggested the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Well, you know, when I was thinking about this, I thought, boy, I bet old Haman, he didn't get too much sleep that night with all the construction going on, you know, and everything, all the hammer and all that from building that big gallows that he was talking about. But anyway, while all that was going on at Haman's house that night, the king couldn't sleep either. You know, Bible doesn't tell us what it was that was keeping him awake. But, you know, maybe it was all the hammering going on over at Haman's house. I don't know. But anyway, since he couldn't sleep, you know, I guess like a lot of us do, we try to find some way to busy our minds to make ourselves sleepy again. And so in verses 6, in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, it says, that night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Here these two guys had tried to, they wanted to kill King Ahasuerus, but Mordecai, you know, he let everybody know about it. He brought it out in the open. And so the king, you know, once he found out about this, he wanted to know, well, you know, what honor or anything has been bestowed on Mordecai for this, you know? Well, they told him nothing's been done for him. Well, to the king, that was disturbing news, because, I mean, here this man had saved his life, and then somehow had fallen off the record, you know, somewhere, and not been discovered until now, and not even a thank you to him or anything like that. Well, the king must have been feeling kind of ashamed of himself because of that. Anyway, by the time this got read to the king and he found out about it, the sun must have been coming up the next morning. because all of a sudden the king hears something. He says, "Who's in the court?" They look out there. Well, Haman's out there standing there. See, Haman was doing just what his wife and his friends had told him to do. He had come there to get permission